Partial results are in for Tuesday's primaries in New York, Kentucky, and Virginia. But with a record number of absentee ballots cast, it could be days before the winners are announced. Early numbers show Democrats from the party's more progressive flank making gains in some races against more establishment members. In New York, progressive newcomer Jamal Bowman is claiming victory against incumbent Congressman Eliot Engel with well over half of the votes counted. Engel has been in Congress for over 3 decades and chairs the powerful Foreign Affairs Committee. In Kentucky's Democratic Senate primary, former Marine pilot Amy McGrath holds a slight lead over State Representative Charles Booker. The winner of that race will take on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this fall. For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Al Cross. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter, and Al is director of the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues at the University of Kentucky. Welcome, Al. Welcome, Caitlin. So much interest in this contest. Al, let me start with you. What is the status of the primary between Amy McGrath and Charles Booker? And give us a sense of how that race played out.
Well, with only 10% of the expected vote counted, you really can't say much about it. It's almost like we were at 7:30 on election night. McGrath holds a lead among the people who walked in to vote yesterday, largely. There are a few counties that have reported their early absentee voting and their total absentee voting, but it's not very many. And the 2 largest counties, Jefferson and Fayette, which Booker, I think, will carry, are not going to report anything, they say, until next Tuesday. So it's very much up in the air. This race tightened very much when the Black Lives Matter protest began, because Louisville was the scene of a rather controversial police killing. And Booker turned out to be a very compelling candidate who caught the wave about as well as any politician I've ever seen. And McGrath has spent about half of the 41 million plus that she raised for running against McConnell, trying to fend off Booker.
Yeah, it really is a contest that has garnered, as I said at the top, so much interest. Caitlin, Kentucky was just one of several places where establishment Democrats fielded challenges from more left-wing candidates. Where else are progressives making inroads, and what is the status of those races?
Well, there were several interesting races here in New York last night, and races that can provide some lessons for Democrats heading into November's election. You mentioned that in the top, the race between Eliot Engel and Jamal Bowman, who is claiming victory in this race. Potentially, if that holds, toppling the Foreign Affairs Chairman, someone who has been in Congress for a long time, deeply entrenched, but really came under fire for not being in his district, for actually living in Potomac, Maryland, came under fire. And this comes as we've seen protests across the country, and especially here in New York, after the George Floyd killing, but also in an area of the country where the pandemic has hit especially hard. And you've had congressional candidates here really talking about those issues of racial injustice and healthcare and costs and all of the disparities that have been even more pronounced through this pandemic. So that was one race that we were watching closely. And then another surprise race also came in New York City congressional district of Carolyn Maloney, a long-time, 3 decades long incumbent Democrat, chair of the once powerful Oversight Committee. She is locked in a very tight race against Suraj Patel for her seat. And so you've seen this surge coming from insurgent candidates who are kind of challenging the status quo within their party and really not waiting their turn. And that's a really interesting dynamic that's coming and shows how quickly the ground has shifted just in the past month. Remember, we just had a long Democratic presidential primary where we saw the most diverse field of candidates for the Democrats, and Joe Biden ended up being the nominee. Now you have a ground quickly shifting. You mentioned Kentucky with Amy McGrath, who 2 years ago was a top candidate after we saw this move from women voters. Now we are seeing potentially a similar movement against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter. And so we'll see what impact that has going into November.
Al, I want to ask you about the process of voting. There was a severe reduction in polling places in Kentucky. Talk to us about how voting went overall and how the state largely managed to avoid some of the problems that we saw earlier this month in Georgia.
Every voter got a postcard. I should say almost every voter. There were some problems with a few addresses. Got a postcard telling them how to get an absentee ballot. And it looks like the great majority of votes will be cast by absentee. And the process seems to be working fairly well. The cumbersome part is it takes a long time to count these absentees. You have to have one person from each party looking over the opening of the ballot and the validation of the signature and running it through the machine and so on. And with about 883,000 absentee ballots issued, and 90% of those expected to be returned, and very few of them counted so far, we will probably have to wait until Tuesday to have a definitive call.
Wow, 883,000. Well, Caitlin, as vote-by-mail operations ramp up ahead of November, President Trump and Attorney General Bill Barr are making significant allegations about the security of those ballots. President Trump has claimed widespread voter fraud since he was first elected, and you've been reporting on this. What did you find?
Right, well, Bill Barr, over the past month, has said a couple of different times that he thinks foreign entities are going to be able to tamper with mail-in ballots. And experts that we have talked to and secretaries of state and election officials say that that is simply not true. That is an unverified claim because the process in place for not only printing ballots but also reading them is very secure and intended and designed to safeguard against any kind of intervention. So while there was foreign interference in the 2016 election that was very much focused on a disinformation campaign, there was no evidence of tampering with mail-in ballots, and there's actually a really low percentage of fraud when it comes to mail-in voting. So there are election experts that are concerned that the president and attorney general are trying to undermine the election results, and that's important because as you have been talking about the issue of mail-in voting, that's coming as people are trying to figure out how to hold a safe election in a pandemic, and so you're seeing states scale up and their vote by mail efforts, and that's really important because these experts have been telling us that these ballots are, come with barcodes, have a ton of security precautions in place, machines to read them, that it's very difficult to penetrate that, and the cases have been so low. But mail-in voting is going to be a huge issue coming into this election.
Elaine, I think it should be noted that we do have absentee ballot fraud in this country, but it's largely from vote buying. People who will sell their vote for $50 and let the person fill out the ballot and put it in. That goes on, and it's almost impossible to stop, but it's very hard to do that on a large scale.
Right, because that's the question. Is it a widespread phenomenon? And I think the evidence has not shown that to be the case.
No, never been seen.
Right, and those cases have been prosecuted.
Right.
Right. Right, very important context there. So Al, as Caitlin was just noting, this is all happening in the middle of a pandemic. If the trend of rising coronavirus cases continues, how might that impact the November election, and specifically, how might that impact be different in rural and urban America?
Well, I think we're going to have more polling locations. The Kentucky Secretary of State said that last night. I think everyone agrees. You just can't have one polling location for a county of 700,000 people like they did in Louisville yesterday. It was well managed, but they had a last-minute rush that required an injunction to let people in for another half hour. So I think there will be more planning ahead. They have more time now to recruit poll workers. That is one of the big problems because poll workers tend to be older, and older people are more susceptible to the virus. Now we've got a lot of younger people interested in the process. I think they've got a pretty good universe of potential poll workers to recruit from.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Al Cross, thank you both very much. Really appreciate it.